If folks can take their seats really quick. I'm just going to do a really quick introduction. My name is Imani Henry. I'm the Student Fellow Collective for the Silver School of Social Work. I wanted to introduce our advisor, Dr. Robert Hawkins, who is going to be moderating this panel on Stop and Frisk, and I'm going to turn the floor over to him.
Thank you. So I'm not going to talk much. I'm just going to really introduce our panel, and I have a few questions. But let me just give you the overview of how this is, what's going to happen here. I'll introduce each panelist. I'll give them each about 5 minutes or so to talk a little bit about what they do. They'll talk a little bit about their work and put it in context for you. Then we'll have just a few questions to get the conversation started, and we'll give them each an opportunity to answer those questions. And then we'll ask questions or take questions from all of you. Sounds good? Okay, all right. And we'll try to do that before you get too hungry. So I know lunch is next. So our first panelist is Cassandra Frederick from the New York Policy Coordinator at the Drug Policy Alliance, Jian Chang, Director of Communities United for Police Reform, and Mitchell Mora, who's a youth leader at Streetwise and Safe, an organization that focuses on the policing and criminalization of LGBTQ youth of color. So I'm going to let each panelist tell us a little bit more about themselves and a little bit about more specifically about their work. Cassandra?
Hi everyone, my name is Cassandra Frederick.
Microphone.
My name is Cassandra Frederick, and I am the New York Policy Coordinator at the Drug Policy Alliance. Drug Policy Alliance is a national organization working to end the war on drugs. We have offices in New York, New Mexico, California, Colorado, New Jersey. And then we have a grants program where we fund grassroots organizations working to do the same thing. I work in the New York Policy Office. DPA works on 4 main areas: harm reduction, sentencing reform, youth policy, focusing on drug education, and the legalization of marijuana. I am here today because of the campaign that I'm leading around unlawful marijuana arrest, which is a collateral consequence of biased policing practices, mainly through Stop and Frisk.
So maybe I'll try to keep it as brief. I'm Ji Hyun with Communities United for Police Reform. We are a coalition of about 60 some odd organizations from across the city, including grassroots legal organizations, policy organizations, and other organizations that actually Drug Policy Alliance and Streetwise and Safe are members of. And we can certainly talk a little bit more about CPR, but I think I want to say 3 things about Stop and Frisk before we start getting started. One is that we believe that Stop and Frisk is not only the largest racial profiling program in the country, but probably in the world. And that it's not actually only a racial profiling program, it's also a discrimination-based profiling program that's based on how officers perceive gender identity expression, how the NYPD perceives housing status, and other factors. So we can talk about that in a moment. But the second thing that I would want to say is that there's been a huge explosion of Stop and Frisk, especially under Mayor Bloomberg since 2002, with over 600% increase of stops, and over close to 90% of those being of Black and Latino New Yorkers, and close to 90% of those not even resulting in a summons or arrest. The third thing I would want to say is that actually, given some of that, part of what's really important to keep in mind in terms of Stop and Frisk is that it's actually part of the gateway pipeline of especially youth of color, but other people in New York, other New Yorkers, to criminal justice system that has really severe consequences that Cassandra can certainly talk about, and Mitchell can talk about, and we can talk about more. But that's really all I wanted to start off with. One fourth thing, which is that there is a huge movement that is growing in New York City and actually around the country to confront Stop and Frisk and discriminatory policing. And we can talk about that some in terms of what's going on in the court cases, as well as what's going on in the streets. but this is actually a moment where I think the tide is turning. So it's pretty exciting to be in New York, especially for those of you who are engaging. And some of the social workers, I think hopefully all of you will be at the Floyd trial, which is a major federal class action stop and frisk trial in federal court. This Wednesday, there's a whole mobilization of social workers to pack the court that day. So hopefully some of you will show up.
Hi, my name is Mitchell Mora, and I'm with Streetwise and Safe. I'm also going to try to keep it really brief. So the work that we do at Streetwise and Safe, we're a part of CPR, and we're on the steering committee there. But we also do Know Your Rights trainings at various drop-in centers and other locations in the city where youth of color hang out, but specifically LGBTQ youth of color. And we also are part of a coalition to end condoms being used as evidence in prostitution-related offenses. We do a lot of advocacy work and really trying to ensure that youth, one, have a place to educate their community and educate our peers, but also being able to access lobbying, meeting with people, talking about their own issues in their own words. And that's definitely something that CPR has prioritized for all of the organizations involved. So I think before we get to questions, just to kind of give you an idea of why our work is important at SAS is, so we know that all youth of color in the city are police. But for LGBTQ youth, that can look very different. And sometimes our experiences look like our peers, but often they don't. Whether that's being made to reveal your genitals for this curiosity, to satisfy the curiosity of a police officer, that can look like being called homophobic, transphobic, derogatory words, names, and a lot of times it looks like sexual assault. So those are kind of the issues that we've been working on. Specifically, just to touch on one issue, I think, with stop and frisk that has really impacted LGBTQ youth is the discriminatory use of stop and frisk in conjunction with the NYPD using condoms as evidence has created a whole climate around youth in the city feeling that it is illegal to carry condoms. And that's something we're asked at our Know Your Rights trainings, how many condoms is it legal to carry? And so, and this is straight youth, but and then also there's a different kind of profiling that happens with queer youth where they're assumed to be engaged in deviant acts, whether that's lewd conduct charges, prostitution charges, and then oftentimes those things may not even lead to being introduced into the criminal justice system. They can also, they look like lectures, being told about who you should be having sex with, how you should be having sex. We did a report a few years ago, just kind of collecting stories of people with stop and frisk and then being profiled as being engaged in prostitution. One of the quotes that we had was a police officer telling someone, taking their condoms and saying, "You deserve to die." And these things, like we understand stop and frisk, these things affect families, they affect communities, and LGBTQ youth are especially vulnerable to these kinds of abuses because we are 40 to 60% of the homeless youth population in the city. Often youth don't feel safe in shelters or places that, with the limited services that New York does offer for homeless youth, often don't feel safe accessing those spaces. So then we have, even within LGBTQ youth being police, LGBT youth of color being police, there's a whole other subset of us that are policed 24/7, where you're going to sleep in the park, the cops going to find you, and there's all these kinds of contributing factors that work around stop and frisk policies. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, that's perfect. Thank you. So I would like to get us started. I have three central questions that I want to focus on, and I'd like to get us started by asking for all of you to think about why this is going on. Not just what is happening, but talk in detail about what are your thoughts about why the stop and frisk happened? What's underneath the policy?
I mean, I think what's underneath the policy is colonialism. I think it looks like a lot of the things we've seen before, of policing of black and brown bodies, and our sexualities and our gender identities. I mean, these things are rooted in a racist and transphobic, homophobic structure. So, yeah, I mean, I also think post 9/11 there was an opportunity to increase these kinds of policing practices, but yeah, I think the larger question is, which I think it's part of the colonial project.
Oh, yeah, please.
So I would say yes to colonialism. As a black woman, I just have to always acknowledge that happening. But also I would say that there's a culture of over-militarization that is happening throughout the country, and that is taking forms in many different ways. I think that while stop and frisk exploded, during the Bloomberg era, there are a lot of policing experts and researchers that are looking and seeing that a lot of it happened, things started to change and shift during the Giuliani administration. There was an administrative decision on the different policing tactics that people were going to be using. When I go around the country and talk to people around issues around the war on drugs and talk about stop and frisk being a vehicle in a way to create social control and create this mentality, people in Georgia are like, we have stop and frisk here too. We don't call it that. I'm like, yeah, it's called walking while black. You know what I mean? It's called driving while black. We just, we're in New York, we gotta be a little extra fancy. We gotta add another name to it, and it's one of the things that, I mean, I have a younger brother, and there are conversations that it's not new. Like a lot of times, a lot of people are talking about, young families of color having to go through certain conversations with their young people, especially their young men, when they reach a certain age. But that's not privy just to New Yorkers, that's all over. Because of the way that we look and because of the way that society has decided to deal with groups of people. So I think it's about over-militarization. I think it's about social control. I think it's about colonialism. And honestly, I think people will say that stop and frisk is about guns, right? Getting guns off the street. But I think they always have to set up an argument that people can't fight, because nobody wants guns on the street, really. I mean, except for the NRA. I mean, nobody really wants that. You can't really fight. Yeah, I don't want, guns are bad, and I can't really say that, but when you look at it, it's really just a facade, right? It's never like we talk about the war on drugs. The war on drugs has never been about drugs. It's always been about controlling people, and it's always been about controlling people of color. Like there's documents that say, Richard Nixon, it's about the blacks. We just have to figure out a way to deal with it without saying that it's about the blacks. So it's just a kind of fancy way, New Yorkers naming it stop and frisk, but honestly it's just walking, driving, breathing while a person of color.
I would say check and check. And then I think part of what I would want to add is that it's, I think part of it for us, stop and frisk symbolizes a much broader broken windows policing approach that, as Cassandra said, got really popularized under Giuliani before Bloomberg, and is now has been exported around the country. But that it's actually, in addition to walking while black, it's also praying while Muslim. It's also actually just being young people in New York City, and that we're in a period right now where there's not only a promotion of a culture of fear and a culture of punishment, but we're also in a period where the last few decades we've seen disinvestments in public infrastructure, right? So at the same time that we're talking about the fact that, or the media, the mayor, the commissioner talked about communities of color and low-income communities as basically criminalized communities, it's also the same time that they've been disinvesting in public education, in even healthcare and other factors, or other kind of structures that actually would support community safety in a really holistic way. And so part of what we're hoping is that in this year, the mayoral, especially with the mayoral elections, that we actually are able to elevate the issues of community safety in a much more real way. That's not just about this BS in terms of stop and frisk supposedly takes guns off the street. Because as Cassandra said, what they found is actually over the years, stop and frisk, in terms of the number of guns that come off the streets because of stops, it's like 0.15%. So I'm not a mathematician, and it's really hard for me to even understand what that looks like, but it's like 1 in 1,000, which is actually less than if you just randomly check people on the street corner. So it's not about guns. I mean, we know this from the facts and the numbers. It's not about guns. We know it from the rhetoric.
Thank you. I also wonder sometimes if it's about giving the impression that you're doing something. So when you see police on the street corner, when you see them in the subways, it sends the message, oh, the police are here, something's being done. And it's a relatively inexpensive way to send that message to a community. And you're targeting people who are already marginalized. So you're not sending a message to those folks, or you're sending a different message to those folks. You're sending a message to the people you've already instilled fear in. So the people who say, oh yeah, we should get those people of color off the street, or of course, that person of color is a gang member, so they must have a gun, so on and so forth. But, sorry, I'm not a panelist.
So I would say to that point, where that money comes from is a federal program. A lot of that money for policing throughout the country comes from burn grants. And burn grants have to deal with policing and drugs and trying to get drugs off the street. So like police precincts and stuff like that, police stations, cars, all that stuff is funded by these federal grants. And in order for places to continue to get grants, they have to show productivity. So they have to do the quotas. Like things that they say that don't exist, we all know that policing quotas exist. They will say it till they're blue in the face. But quotas exist, and the reason why quotas exist is because it's tied to the money that the departments are getting. I don't know how many of you watched it, but when I was in social work school, the classes were, and I watched The Wire, and it taught me everything that I So it's always been about the money, who they can make money off of. That ties back to colonialism, ties back to over-militarization. It's no mistake. The reason why there are quotas is because they're getting money based off quotas. So it's important to realize when people have conversations, it's always the smartest way is to follow the money. And why NYPD is the largest policing force. Why Ray Kelly is going around 60 Minutes talking about he can shoot a small plane down from his office. How did you get funded for that? The federal tax dollars are paying for that. It's called JAG, it's called burn money. And it's the reason why we're in such a messed up situation.
Thank you. So we'll all watch The Wire. So my next question, somewhat related to this, sort of moves on to the psychological and the emotional. So what has been the psychological or emotional impact that stop and frisk policies have incurred? So what's been the psychological and emotional impact on individuals and communities?
I think for LGBTQ youth of color specifically, I don't even know where to begin to tackle that question. The feeling that you can be violated at any time, that you don't know how you're going to be read if you're trans or gender non-conforming, what the possibilities of that could mean, what may have happened to you previously, what may have happened to your friend, and especially for people already so marginalized, already experiencing so much discrimination based on their race and sexual or gender identities, to have no one to go to if you are attacked, or if something would happen to you. I mean, there's just absolutely no feeling of safety. I mean, this question is like really hard, because I think imagining stop and frisk, we talk about all of the, the introduction to the criminal and justice system, all these like horrible things, and I think it's going to be a long process to unpack what kind of psychological traumas this has put into our communities. And I feel like that's really heavy, and that work has to start. And just to add before I hand it over, and then especially for LGBTQ youth, that being brought up on a false drug charge, or on a prostitution charge, or even if you were doing something, but you're taken in and put into this whole system where they may not recognize your gender identity, where you may be experiencing all kinds of homophobic violence in your cell, or from the police officers. I was talking with a colleague last week, someone that I work with, where she was arrested, taken down to the station, and made a strip search by 4 officers in front of a cell. And she's trans, and they were all male. And that kind of violation is common. And when she was 17 when that happened, and when she talked about it, she's like, yeah, I just thought that was the way it was. So I think the constant violation of our bodies is something that we have to sort of go through.
There's 2 stories I want to share. One is, I don't know if any of you saw, there was a New York Times op-doc maybe a year ago that was called Scars of Stop and Frisk. A young man named Ted Feinberg, who is a member of a grassroots organization called Make Road New York. He's one of our members. And he talks about being stopped over 60 times before he turned 18 years old. And so when you count that, that's not only, I mean, the scars of that on one person, and it's not only him, it's not an uncommon story, but the scars of that on his family, on his neighbors, to basically feel like just to go outside to get a carton of milk, to go to school, to come back home from school, all of that actually is subject to policing in a way that's really invasive, it's humiliating, it's degrading. And he actually even talks about the fact that it made him not want to actually go outside. It made him not want to participate in school activities, because then he might come home a little bit later. And so all of that, in terms of the collateral consequences that don't get counted, that aren't quantifiable, but actually have such deep impact on the psyches of not only individuals, but of families, of communities, and of the city as a whole. A second story I want to share is the story of the Floyd trial right now is the lead plaintiffs are actually members of a group called the Malcolm X Grassroots Movement. And what people don't know is that this huge major stop and frisk Floyd trial right now that's in the news pretty much every single day. Well, let me just check. How many of you have never heard of the Floyd stop and frisk trial? Okay, that's fair. It's in the news every single day since probably, are we in the month of April? Still. So since March. But the precursor to that was, those of you who were in New York in the 90s might remember that Amadou Diallo was killed by cops and was shot at 41 times. And after that, the Street Crimes Unit, which was the unit that actually killed Amadou Diallo, they were actually the stop and frisk front guard for the NYPD. And there was a precursor lawsuit called Daniels versus New York City, and Malcolm X Grassroots Movement's members were also part of the Daniels lawsuit. And the reason I kind of cite that is that I think it's also important to know that there are also New Yorkers who have been able to, with the support of organizations and their communities, to, in spite of the experiences of being unjustly stopped, to take action to really actually fight back and make the cause known for broader sectors of New York, beyond just what their individual experiences are. And so what's able to happen in the Floyd lawsuit right now is only able to happen because of the courage and the bravery of folks like members of Malcolm X Grassroots Movement who brought the Daniels lawsuit in the first place that ended up shutting down the Street Crimes Unit and started this new trial right now that's basically put the NYPD stop and frisk program on trial in federal.
Okay, thank you. I was thinking about the long-term ramifications of this, and And, one charge for young people, certain young people, can really derail your life plans. And so, and then the psychological impact of that the collateral of all that can be pretty devastating. And it is something that we don't spend a lot of time thinking about. So I'm glad you are all thinking about it. My other question, and you all have touched on this in one way or another, but I'd like for you to talk about it a little bit more. What are some of the work that's being done, the advocacy that's being done right now that people in this room that we could all get involved with? Could you speak a little bit about some of the things that are going on? You've touched on it, but if we wanted to leave this room and do something, what would we do?
There's a few things that I'll share, and I'm actually going to ask. Okay. So one, I'll start with some policy work. Secondly, some of the electoral strategy, and third, some grassroots strategy. Although I guess I should start with some of the lawyer stuff since I kept talking about the Floyd trial. So there's actually a lot of coordination across sectors that's happening right now in New York City that is really pretty unprecedented. I mean, first of all, lawyers don't usually talk to each other, let alone grassroots activists, but there's some coordination happening amongst grassroots activists, meetings, policy walks. And part of what we're seeing right now is that there's a set of council bills that's called the Community Safety Act in the City Council right now. You might have heard that about a month ago, the City Council Speaker, Christine Quinn, expressed some support for one of those bills, which would establish an Inspector General, an independent Inspector General of the NYPD. There are three other bills that are incredibly important. One is to ban profiling, discriminatory-based profiling, so to ban race-based profiling, profiling based on sexual orientation and gender identity, profiling based on housing status. There's a third bill that's specifically around, actually relates, and I'll let Cassandra talk about it, relates to some of the unjust marijuana arrests, because right now there is pretty much an epidemic of basically illegal searches that cops do. And so this would actually put some safeguards in place around the unlawful searches that are happening. And fourth is requiring some kind of transparency between officers and community members by having officers have to actually give some sort of identification to community members in any stop encounter. So those four bills together in the City Council is part of where we're trying to move some policy reforms. Let me just be clear that none of us believe that that will end the epidemic of racist policing, and none of us believe that that's actually kind of the final solution. But we do think that some of these policy reforms are really critical to be able to start to move the dial on what's happening publicly. A second area of work, though, that is really complementary is the work happening in various communities to exercise the right to conduct observation and documentation of police misconduct. So a lot of groups call that cop watch, but really being able to, when you see something going down on your block, with officers confronting young people and telling them to get up against the wall, that community members are actually taking out their cameras. So when there were protests in East Flatbush a few weeks ago after the killing of Kamani Gray, you saw community members coming out of bodegas, et cetera, taking out their cameras, watching the cops as they were basically battering on young people. And that's part of the work in terms of really building a culture of communities taking care of each other and watching each other's backs in these situations. A third overall strategy, I think, is in terms of just know your rights training. So I'm going to stop there because both Cassandra's organization as well as Mitchell's organization do a good deal of know your rights trainings as well as some other strategies.
So I think, we do a lot of know your rights trainings throughout the city. I think one of the things that we try to hold at SAS, I guess I don't know if this is a way to get involved necessarily, but I think one of the things we do at SAS is also hold the understanding that even if you know your rights, the police often violate those. So even if you say, I do not consent to a search, as I have 4 times, you may still be forced to be and search. or to show what's in your bag or those kinds of things. So I think that's definitely one thing that a lot of communities have been doing Know Your Rights. Ours is specific to LGBTQ youth, and definitely standing in solidarity and acknowledging that we're often profiled as being engaged in sex work, so it's very specific. And then at the same time speaking to like the larger policing that youth of color face in the city. I think to get involved, I think one of the things I was going to say was cop watch. Definitely, when you see the police, pull out your phone, stand a reasonable distance away, but pull out your phone and record the interaction. There's actually an app that the NYCLU did. It's a stop and frisk app, and you can. It's free. You download it, you can record it, and then you can send it to the NYCLU, and they and just for documentation purposes. And then if something happens, you have this recording. It's going to the lawyers, etc. So I think that's one way that's really useful. And I think communities are getting familiar with it. I remember the first times I started to do that, there would sometimes, people would be like, "Why are you recording me?" And definitely, there's been a change, and I think communities of color are becoming more aware throughout the city about this way of documenting police, which is also speaking to one, like working and watching our backs in our communities, and then just larger as the city, as people of color in the city, understanding that this is a strategy we're using to monitor our engagement or experiences with the police.
So, ways to get involved. So one thing that was mentioned here today that Drew Young brought up was that a lot of the stops don't result in an arrest, 90%. The other 10%, there are some minutes and arrests. Majority of those are actually marijuana arrests. And I just want to take a few minutes to explain what's going on. So in New York, marijuana has been decriminalized since 1977. So that means everyone in this room can have up to 25 grams in their possession, and it should only be a $100 ticket. However, if marijuana is in plain view, you're waving it in the air like you just don't care, or if it's burning, then that is an arrestable misdemeanor. It's important to know why that happened. So when Richard Nixon, former president, declared the war on drugs, he said drugs are public enemy #1. And our former governor in New York, Nelson Rockefeller, actually created the blueprint for what the drug war would look like in the state. And because New York is #1, everyone followed suit. So in New York in 1973, small amounts of drugs resulted in mandatory minimums. Marijuana was included in those. However, young white people, it was the 70s, Kevin Arnold from the Wonder Years, they were getting arrested for marijuana. And their parents were very upset, right? So, parents were going up to police officers and district attorneys. They went to the district attorneys and they said, Kevin and Wendy, they should not have been smoking, but they also should not be going to jail for 15 years to life, right? Very serious. So the district attorneys then went to the state legislators, and the state legislators decided to take marijuana outside of the Rockefeller drug laws. So then marijuana became decriminalized because they realized that it was criminalizing young people, and it's not a good way to use our youth. It was a waste of police resources, and it was not an effective way to deal with marijuana use. In 1977, mind you, in 1977, that was the highest peak of marijuana use. In the highest peak of marijuana use, the legislature decided that arresting people was not going to make people stop using drugs. Policing, from 1977 all the way to the early 90s, people weren't getting arrested for marijuana. But like we said before, policing strategies changed in the early 90s. Broken window policies, quality of life arrests, and marijuana arrests started to go up. Why? Because they started using policing tactics like stop and frisk. Like I said before, marijuana in your pocket, in your purse, in your hat, in your shoe, in your sock, in your underwear is a $100 ticket. However, marijuana in plain view or burning is an arrestable misdemeanor. When a police officer encounters a young black person, young Latino person, and asks them what's in your pockets, or more likely goes inside of their pockets and pulls out the marijuana, instead of charging them with marijuana possession as they should, they're arresting them. They are arresting them for marijuana in plain view, even though the police officer is the one with the marijuana in their hand. The police officer is the one talking to the young person, waving it in the air like they just don't care, right? Or there are people that are getting arrested for smoking marijuana, but actually weren't smoking, actually weren't even in possession of marijuana, because it goes back to the quotas. And this is true because I've met the people. This is also true because I met a young woman who got her child taken away from her because an officer arrested her for smoking marijuana. Now, if there are anybody in here who knows anything about marijuana in jobs, you would know that marijuana stays in your system for 30 days. She tested 3 times. All 3 times she passed the test. She got arrested in December, did not get her child back until August of the next year. I'm in a room of social workers that want to figure out how to get involved. The child welfare system associated with bias policing and manufactured drug arrests are ripping apart families. Our policies, I'm a social worker, I don't say it often, and that is for a very good reason. Ripping apart families based on manufactured things that come from bias policing and come from manufactured misdemeanor arrests like marijuana arrests. CPR, this whole table. One of the bills that Jiyoung mentioned was the consent to search bill. And that's because of the rampant amount of violations that are being, the civil constitutional violations that are being done every day to New Yorkers. Like I said before, marijuana in your pocket is a $100 ticket. Marijuana outside is an arrestable misdemeanor. We are working legislatively to try to close that loophole. But the root of the problem is the illegal search. We have to pass that bill so police officers know that they can't rifle through our pockets and our bodies for some cockamamie kind of reason. So ways that people can get involved is by, 1, going to the Ford trial, 2, taking responsibility of the agency that you have as social workers, and really trying to push back against the policies that are collateral consequences of bias policing. And then also, coming out to actions. That would be great. That would be awesome. Come out to actions and sign up for our listservs. I know everyone hates emails and blah, 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 blah. But I'm pretty sure that one of the reasons why you got involved in social work is because you believe that you can be an agent of change. And the change that you will see is when you are out in the streets. You can find them in textbooks, but you're going to find them in the streets more often, and trying to apply the theories that you're learning in class. So I would suggest that if you are interested, really interested in finding more ways to be involved, that you reach out to the people on this panel, on the panel before, and figure out different ways we can plug you into the conversation.
Thank you very much. I want to make sure that we get questions from the audience. So thank you so much for that. Any questions? Yes, sir. Got the hand up really fast. That was good.
Well, I'm not a student here. I'm an activist in a group called Police Reform Organizing Project, and also an activist in a multi-issue LGBT political cause. My question first is, does anyone really believe that the Inspector General bill, which politicians are suddenly embracing, would have made any difference at all if the Inspector General is reporting to the Commissioner of the Department of Investigation under either Bloomberg or Giuliani? And if we're going to change policies, is it enough simply to change the law without there being true accountability? Shouldn't we be demanding that the architects of these illegal mass arrests themselves be subjected to the criminal justice system, including Commissioner Kelly?
Great question. Who wants that?
It's a fun one. There's actually maybe about 5 questions, so I'm going to try to do a few of the pieces that I heard from you. One is that, people who know my history know that I'm actually not somebody who thinks that legislative reform ever actually ends or solves a problem. But I do think that it's an important tactic and it's a tool, and we don't have that many tools in terms of movement work. So as far as I'm concerned, we use whatever tools we've got. So that includes not only legislative work, it includes organizing the streets, it includes direct action, it includes civil disobedience. As far as the Inspector General bill, a few things. One is that the commissioner of the Department of Investigations is the only commissioner in the city council that is not only appointed by the mayor, but also is consent and I forget what it's called, it's one of those legal words, but consent and something by the city council. And basically what that means is that the city council actually gets to weigh in on the appointment of the next DOI commissioner, which is not true of any other commissioners. And so for the legal limitations of what the city council can do, I actually think that an inspector general within the DOI is not a bad thing. In fact, it's an actually really good thing and provides some opportunities for those of us who do actually organize in the streets to request in future cases that there be more transparency, that there be reports on some of these other issues. For council members like Jumaane Williams, who you all, I think, is on your schedule for later today, for them to be able to say in the city council, we want to hear a report on Stop and Frisk. We want to hear a report on surveillance in Muslim communities. So for the limitations of what any legislative effort has, I think that the Inspector General bill is actually incredibly important, especially not just for Stop and Frisk, but for issues like excessive force, for issues like surveillance in Muslim communities, and all of these issues that it's easy for those of us on the outside to say, well, we should be dealing with this anyway, but legislators actually need tools to be able to have those things come into their conversations at City Hall on official record. And then those of us who are activists get to use those as tools to expose a system that doesn't work and actually advocate for other things that do work. In terms of, I feel like there were 2 other questions you had, but I don't remember what they were. I'm just going to stop with the DOI commissioner, but I do want to keep saying that the 4 bills of the Community Safety Act were conceived because they all work together. None of them solve the overall problem, and actually even as a package, they don't solve the problem, but I think that they're actually a really important step towards actually demanding more and having more accountability in the MIPD. And for those of us who look back at the past few decades, there's not been legislation coming out of the city council or the state legislature in the past few decades that's about NYPD accountability. So as far as I'm concerned, as somebody who's been in this movement for a little while at least, is that this is any kind of accountability that we can get through formal measures is actually a really positive thing, because it basically shows a complete sea change. This conversation couldn't even have happened. We couldn't even have introduced these 4 bills 10 years ago at the city council. So whether or not you believe in legislative reform, what it does, I think, is signal that actually New Yorkers are fed up with discriminatory policing, and New Yorkers will stand up against it. And that's regardless of whether or not you believe in legislation itself.
I would say to your latter part of the question about what we should do with people with the incredible mass of arrests and trying to hold the people accountable that are doing the arresting, I think that really goes to changing the climate in the communities that people are being arrested. I think a lot of times, most of the time, and I'm an advocate as well, I feel like the police run without any kind of rules. And this is not to say that police officers aren't good people or that, you know, they don't have a dangerous job. They do. I mean, I don't want to be a police officer. I never wanted to be a police officer. But I think it's about changing the climate and getting people to reinvest in the system that we are saying is going to help them, right? So when I meet someone who's been illegally arrested for marijuana and I say, hey, I want to hear your story, I want to bring you to elected officials, the look that they give me is that it's not going to matter, right? So if they're not willing to go to a sympathetic ear like Jumaane Williams and tell their story, what makes me think that they're going to walk into like a reporting establishment to report an officer for the illegal things that they've done? So I think it's on advocates and on us to really start to push the conversation where it's like, no, actually we do have power and there are things there to hold people accountable. And we have to figure out a way to get people to make that step, and by supporting them. I mean, because NYPD, the thing that we don't hear a lot is that they spend a lot of money on lawsuits. A lot of money. A lot of taxpayer money. Every day they're doing settlements. Every day, based on beating people up, running up in people's houses. There are people making complaints. There are police officers that are getting pulled off certain blocks because they can no longer protect them. It's really important that we continue to push the pressure and create the system that we want, that community members want, to have fair and just accountability. And I think your questions are right. How do we get the biggest, guy right now, Commissioner Ray Kelly, to be held accountable for the mass amount of injustices that happened under his tenure? And I think one of them is holding mayoral candidates accountable for saying that they're going to keep Ray Kelly as their police commissioner. What the hell is going on? Are you not paying attention to what's happening in the communities, the people that are being devastated by these policies? We have to figure out different ways. Like I can go to Albany all day, every day, spend nights in that dreary place, and things won't, writing something on a piece of paper is not the same thing as getting something done. And I think we just have to figure out and be more creative in the different tools that we can use.
Thank you. We have about 10 minutes. Kevin.
Yeah, I just want to say I appreciate each of your work in this conversation. I run a homeless shelter on the Upper West Side for homeless LGBT youth. 99% are youth of color. And one of the experiences that has came up a lot, above and beyond the fact that the Stop and Frisk experience, something that sort of permeates every day and every night at the shelter, is in addition to being stopped with the condoms, quite a few of our youth who are trans that do hormone therapy have syringes, and I've had youth arrested, incarcerated, have false drug charges applied to them as a result of carrying these prescribed syringes as a part of the hormone therapy. So I'm curious, is there a specific element of the Stop and Frisk activism or discussion or movement that's specifically addressing this?
So I would say that my organization worked a lot on syringe exchanges and syringe possession. So people should not get arrested for syringes if they're part of an ESAP program. Like they have a card. If they have a card from a syringe exchange that says that they are a participant, they should not be getting arrested. What we do know is that that's not happening, that people are always getting arrested for it. And we worked with our allies, local New York, from Brooklyn, a lot on the syringe possession issue because we know that people are getting arrested for possession of syringes even when they have an ESAP card. And so one, no, they should not be getting arrested for possessions of syringes. And one of the things, it's actually one of the things that we discuss in our Know Your Rights trainings because our work is focused around drug possession and drugs and drug policy in general, is one of the things that we constantly talk about is syringes. And it's really important that your young people try to get registered in an ESAP program to kind of get those protections because that's kind of what the law protects you to do right now. And then it's really hard because sometimes we have peer-to-peer delivery services where peers give syringes out to people. So someone who might not have an ESAP card gets a syringe but from a syringe exchange and returns them back through a syringe exchange. But I think in order to try to cover your bases, as we continue to push the envelope more so that more people can get access to clean syringes, that they participate in an ESAP program to try to cover some sort of base.
The only thing I wanted to add is that I think this goes back to what Mitchell was saying before in terms of rights and realities, and we kind of think about it in kind of three R's. There's the rights of what people have, there's the reality of what happens, and then there's the responsibility of what those of us, including folks who are affected, need to do. And in this case, what you're describing is really, in part, oftentimes the result of illegal searches. It's the same kind of cause or root action that Cassandra talked about in terms of the unlawful marijuana arrests. It's the same cops who are coming in saying, empty your pockets, are actually more likely going into your pockets, going into your purse. And so that part of what we actually do have to expose is that a lot of this is happening through illegal police activity in terms of people being unlawfully then arrested or summoned. And then there's also a group called New York New York Harm Reduction Educators. I'm also working with right? Nairi, who's part of CPR, who've actually been doing not only testimony around this specifically, but organizing members around it.
Okay, we probably have time for maybe one more question. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, so I'm not a social worker, I'm actually a business student and also an activist in different areas. So I'm just wondering, just out of curiosity, I work with a lot of entrepreneurs and they do background checks. So what sort of conversation can I have with my business owners about, when you see some record come up and it's probably the result of some sort of vendor research or something like that, what can I do to sort of educate my entrepreneurs about the fact that there's a great possibility that this may have been the result of some sort of not damaging situation, where the person actually is not in the system because they were criminal, but just because it was, they missed a court case or something like that.
The immediate thing that came to my mind right now maybe doesn't directly respond to this, but actually a lot of what I've learned from groups like Drug Policy Alliance or Vocal are the statistics, the racially discriminatory statistics of who uses, for example, who uses marijuana. Probably like if I walk down the block to an NYU dorm, I would probably have a contact high. Versus who actually get summons or arrested. And I think that part of what we have to keep remembering is that the way in which people experience the criminal justice system is not necessarily based on whether or not people are engaging in quote-unquote criminal acts, but a lot of it is actually based on how people are policed, which isn't always about what an individual might have done. And so I just keep thinking back to really Cassandra, you know these better than me in terms of the statistics around how
Right.
this exactly.
And I think that's exactly right. So young white men actually smoke and possess and sell marijuana at higher rates, but 87% of the arrests are Black and Latino, 70% under the age of 30, 52% between the ages of 16 and 22. So the people that are having these things come up on their background checks are not the people that are using the most, and it's just as a result of the way that they're policed because of the way that they look or are perceived to look. I think something that's really important is I know that businesses are always trying to figure out how to keep costs down. And sometimes the background check places that they use tend to be of the cheaper end. And the cheaper ends tend to not have the most up-to-date information. So a lot of the warrants that they'll get are outdated, or they've dealt with them. If you get a marijuana arrest and you don't get arrested again, your record is supposed to be sealed. But depending on the company that business owners use, that may or may not show up in the background check, and that affects if someone gets the job. So I think, one, it's about making a conscious and intentional decision to try to have the most updated background check services that you're using. And then some of it is just looking, I know that it's really hard to do this, but looking at each applicant, like if someone has like freaking marijuana ACD and you don't want to give them a job at freaking Best Buy, like that's ridiculous. I mean, most of the people up in there are probably smoking in the back. I'm not condoning marijuana usage, but I'm also not demonizing it as well. I think we have to be realistic that drugs have always been a part of society. They always will be, and we just have to have more responsible measures to dealing with it. So I think for the business community, one of them is, one, educating yourself about where you're doing business. If you're doing business in New York, you have to realize that NYPD is running rampant up in here and have no accountability. So if you're trying to hire New Yorkers, you need to take that into account in your hiring process. And also, if you are really careful, if you really care about being a responsible business owner and hiring people from New York, then you have to invest in that. If you want to invest in your employees, then you invest in background checks that are going to be most up to date, so that people aren't being held accountable for the bogus arrests that have been happening.
Thank you. And if I can add to that, not being a panelist, think about who gets a background check and what level we're talking about. So I would ask them if a background check is even necessary. And one thing that I definitely realize is that as I moved up the ladder, as other people I know have moved up the ladder, the background check stopped. And so the farther up you go, the less likely actually, unless you're being appointed by the mayor, actually that doesn't matter, but by the president. So think about, do we really need a background check for Best Buy? Do we really need a background check for Target? Maybe some of the background checks aren't always necessary. So with that, I'd like to thank our panelists.